Good afternoon, everyone. We are back. I hope you're all doing well. It's Monday, the 11th of May. I hope you're all trying to work your way around the announcements that came out yesterday and doing a better job of figuring out all of that than I've been doing. But there you go. As we've said throughout the week, guys, we are joined live on the line today by Cees Smit, who is a Haemophilia Patient Advocate and Author, joining us all the way from the Netherlands. And for one of the first times today as well, he's joining us by video, which is hopefully something we can carry on doing as well. Cees, how are you doing?
Well, I'm fine, and also we have to do today with, let's say, an opening up of the intelligent lockdown the Netherlands are in. But so far, the last 8 weeks, we could go outside, but I have also been very careful in my contacts outside, and we don't see our children and grandchildren
Sure.
in the house, but only outside on a playing ground and so on. So I hope everyone is well and doing well with the corona issue.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's much the same here for us as I think it is for you. But look, I know to everyone listening, I had said at the end of last week's stream that this week we might go for a panorama theme because it is now some 3 years since the BBC Panorama documentary aired. However, I think there are copyright issues in doing what we were planning on doing, and also when Cees kindly agreed to do this interview, I thought that would be much more interesting for everyone. So I'm very grateful. But look, Cees, we've got so much to discuss. I think everyone that's tuning in now is going to be really interested to kind of hear your side of events and what happened in the Netherlands. So I wanted to kind of just dive straight into it really and go back to 1979, and that was the year that you began to go to the World Federation of Haemophilia conferences. And in 1979 that conference then was held in Tel Aviv. And I wanted to ask you, what was it at that time in 79 that prompted you to decide that you wanted to go to these conferences? And what was the conference in Tel Aviv what you expected?
We had in that year about the 8 years existence of our Haemophilia Society that was founded in 1971 with, let's say, the event of the first possibilities to treat hemophilia. And in 1971, we also held a large mail questionnaire, which we sent to all the hemophiliacs we knew at that time in the Netherlands. And we asked all kinds of medical and social data to them to get an impression how the situation of hemophiliacs was at that time, and with the idea to have, after a couple of years, a follow-up. And at that time, I also started my studies in business economics in Amsterdam. And when we had the second round of that hemophilia survey in 1978, I took part in that research project as a patient researcher, which was very advanced for that time. And I especially studied the advantages and disadvantages of home treatment. And I worked permission and money from my boss then to go to Tel Aviv and to present the results there at the World Federation conference. And for me, it was the first time that we could go from to a hemophilia congress, because the congresses were held in New York and in Tokyo, and most of the time only doctors went there and not from the patient groups because it was too much expensive and it was also too medically oriented. So the World Federation conference in Tel Aviv was my first World Federation conference. And well, as a society in the Netherlands, we were rather modest in our activities. We had not so much money, and we had very modest venues where we held our 2 yearly meetings. And so when I arrived at the conference from the World Federation, I was a little bit impressed by all the luxury. It was held in the Hilton Hotel in Tel Aviv, and there were a lot of social activities that were sponsored by the companies. Produced the, let's say, the factor VIII concentrates moment, which were making, let's say, a large progress in its use. And on one of the last evenings, there was also a reception held in honor of the president of the World Federation, Frank Snabel. And that reception was held in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And that is one of the most exclusive hotels all over the world. And so, as a very modest guy from the Netherlands, I was a little bit impressed by all that luxury. And I wondered a little bit, how is that possible? Who is paying for all this? And it was all paid and offered to the World Federation by Thomas O. Hecht. And later it proved out to be that Thomas O. Hecht was a plasma broker from Canada. He had a company called Continental Pharma, and he was a good friend of Frank Snabel, the president of the World Federation at that time. And when I came back, I discussed this conference and what I picked up there on information with my friend Piet Hagen. And Piet Hagen, he has a son with hemophilia, and he was a journalist at that time at a daily newspaper in the Netherlands. And more or less at the same time, also in the Netherlands, we had import from factor VIII and factor IX concentrates from the United States.
Now, just to interrupt you a second there, Cees. So, Pierre Hagen, who Cees is mentioning, was the author of this book that you can all see on the screen that I'm holding here, and it's called Blood, Gift or Merchandise. I was actually saying to Cees just before we came on, it's an incredible book, really, especially when you take into account, you know, when this book was written in the late 70s, early 80s. It's an incredible amount of research, and it's a book that even now I will look at to understand. You know, it chronicles in great detail the pharmaceutical companies that were producing factor products and who was involved and the nature of the blood and fractionation system. And I did want to, I think you were just coming on to this, Cees, but you attended a number of these conferences in the early 80s, you know, specifically during the HIV crisis. And I think you were coming on to this, but let's talk about the HIV crisis. And I think it's important for people listening to understand that the policies and the decisions, as you're just coming on to, taken in the Netherlands were quite different from what happened in the UK. So Cees, could you, and I think you were just going to say, could you just explain, you know, what decisions were taken in the Netherlands in the early 80s in relation to American factor products, and what were the national policies at that time, and how did they happen?
Yeah, well, let me first say about the book of Piet Hagen, that book contains a lot of information, and that was just published in let's say May 1982, and in July 1982 there were the first messages of hemophilia and HIV. So what we gathered on information on the possible dangers of the trade in human blood plasma and the risk of paid donors was, let's say, compromised in that book. So that was, let's say, is an important piece of information to understand what kind of information was already known at that moment. And in the Netherlands, we followed in the 70s, let's say, a policy to use unpaid donations from voluntary donors from the Netherlands. And from these donors and their plasma, there was a 4-donor cryoprecipitate made. So there was wet cryoprecipitate, which was a little bit larger in volume. And there was a 4-donor cryoprecipitate, which was, let's say, the smallest size of cryoprecipitate, which was used in the early 70s, and also for factor 9. And during the 70s, there was an increasing demand for factor 8 because people were used to have, let's say, more freedom to treat themselves at home and also prophylactically 2 or 3 times a week. And therefore, there was a great demand of factor 8. And gradually, at the end of the 70s, there were some hemophilia centers who decided to use American concentrates, which were, let's say, made from large pools of donors and also were made from paid donations. And there was a certain tension between, let's say, the small pool cryoprecipitate and the small pool concentrates were made also in the Netherlands from the mid-70s. Because then you had, with the small pool concentrates, you had a higher yield of factor 8, whereas with the large pool concentrates, you had a lower yield of factor 8. So we were always discussing within the Haemophilia Society that the larger the demand, the more the need of donors, but that there was a certain preference for small pool concentrates because of a lower risk of hepatitis and also maybe unknown viruses. And with the introduction of the large pool concentrates from the United States from paid donors, we thought that there was an implicit risk of also a contamination with hepatitis and also with unknown viruses. So that was more or less the situation in 1979. And then one American company imported their factor 8 concentrates illegally, and one company applied at the court for an import license. Wow. And both products were more or less used in the Netherlands in 1979 and from then till 1982, 1983, when we heard the first messages about HIV. And the court case was won by the American company. So from that time on, in let's say 1979, there was an official possibility to import US concentrates. And that was heavily debated within the Netherlands Haemophilia Society with hemophilia doctors and hemophilia patients. You can follow it so far?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so there was also a kind of division between certain parts of the Haemophilia Society who were in favor of the import of American concentrates. And there were also a number of patients, and I think it was the majority, who favored still the use of the smaller concentrates, small pool concentrates from unpaid Dutch donors. And that was also the situation, let's say, in 1982, when we had the first messages of HIV. And I don't know very well that I read it for the first time in a Dutch newspaper in July 1982. and that there was a risk that hemophiliacs could develop AIDS through contaminated blood. And at that time, we discussed that during the summer within the board of the Netherlands Haemophilia Society. I was secretary of that board at that time. And we decided after the summer and after everyone was returned from holiday to write a letter to the blood transfusion services in the Netherlands to ask them for more information about this possible risk.
Right.
And you have to realize that in the summer of 1982, we had no social media, we had no internet, so all the information had to come from letters or from fax machines. And the Dutch blood infusion services informed in the United States with their colleagues of the American Red Cross what was going on. And by Christmas 1982, it was quite clear that there was a serious problem with regard to the transmission of, we didn't say AIDS at that time, but it was called GRIDS, gay-related immune deficiency syndrome, and later it would mention AIDS. And during Christmas, we had the first discussions with the blood infusion services and later with the public health authorities about what was going on. And then on January the 5th of 1983, we sent a first information letter to the hemophiliacs who were member of our society. And the Haemophilia Center sent it also to the patients they knew about a possible risk that the products for hemophilia could be contaminated with HIV. And we sent a second letter on February 12th. And so that was, let's say, our first activity in that area. And later in January 1983, we also had a large meeting with the public health authorities, with representatives from the gay community in Amsterdam, with the Ministry of Health, where we also discussed
how difficult did you find it, Cees? Because at that time, that's a very crucial point in time, and it seems like in the US, here I think there was very little, but I know in the US they were finding it very difficult to get all these different groups, in particular, the gay community, industry, haemophilia, to get them all together. How difficult was it to get all those different communities together to sit down?
Well, that was rather easy because everyone knew that this was a problem, and already in the gay community in Amsterdam, there were cases of AIDS. So it was quite clear that there was a problem coming on. And let's say all the parties were well informed as best as possible at that time from their colleagues in the United States about what was going on. And at that time, we didn't have any contact with the hemophilia community in the United States. And it was only later in 1987 that I learned from the book from Andy Shields and the band Played On, that at that time, and also in the beginning of 1983, early also at the end of 1982, that there were, let's say, meetings of the industry, the Haemophilia Society, the hematologist, the Center for Disease Control, and the health authorities about the possible danger of AIDS. But it looked like a number of parties could not believe that there was a serious problem. And that was the main issue, I think, in the American hemophilia community, that there was large disagreement how serious this problem was. And the companies denied that there was any problem at all. And some hematologists followed the line of the companies, and some hematologists followed lines that were followed also in Europe to use only small pool cryoprecipitate.
Yeah, yeah. What were the decisions or the conclusions that came out of these meetings in 1983 in terms of factor VIII products? What decisions were made?
Well, the analysis was made that it would be beneficial to stop with the treatment with American concentrates and to use as much as possible the smaller pool Dutch factor VIII and factor IX products.
Right.
From voluntary donors, and also to be very careful with the use of factor VIII, factor IX. And that was a difficult point in time because some people were used to the freedom we had from the products and they didn't want to stop with it because they feared that, let's say, the bleeding problems from hemophilia would return. And so some people stopped with the treatment and only treated when they had the bleed. And some people went on with their treatment, just like me also. And also for parents, it was very difficult to when to infuse hemophilia factor to their child, yes or no. And so that was, let's say, the situation we were in between, let's say, the end of 1982 till, let's say, 1985, when the heat treatment was introduced and when there was let's say, a test for AIDS available. So there has been a period of 2 years in which we treated ourselves with products which could be contaminated with AIDS. But as a safety measure, as I mentioned, we try to avoid the use of large pool concentrates because you have to understand how large is the pool, and if you have one donor in a large pool, the whole pool is contaminated. And that risk is with a small pool concentrate is, let's say, also smaller.
So I think that's one of the key differences, for people to understand is that with that policy you're saying the Netherlands adopted of, trying to stick to local product cryo or be it factor and the smaller pools, whereas here in the UK we used American products right the way throughout, into 1985, non-heated or not. And I think it's important then, as a result of that, to look at the outcomes. So when all said and done, what, in terms of the incidence of HIV infection in the Netherlands, what did that look like?
Well, I can say that on a total of 1,600 hemophiliacs, at the end of the day, 155 hemophiliacs have been contaminated with HIV, which means that among the patients with severe hemophilia, we speak of about 15%. And most of these infections have occurred on the group which used American concentrates. Right. So we have a number of hemophilia centers where between 1979 and 1982, a large group of patients used American concentrates. And especially in these patients, we see a much higher percentage of HIV infections than in the group who used material from voluntary donors from the Dutch Red Cross. And that's a trend we have seen in Europe, in Belgium. In Belgium, the percentage of infected hemophiliacs with HIV is much lower than in the Netherlands, around 1 or 2%. And we have seen that also in the Scandinavian countries, where also the number of HIV-infected hemophiliacs is rather low. And then you see that, let's say, in a number of European countries like the UK, Germany, Spain, Italy, because of the large import of American concentrates, the percentages of HIV-infected hemophiliacs lies around 50% or higher.
That's right. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, before the show today, I actually had a look at the stats and the percentages. So in the UK during the material time, we had something like 3,000 to 4,000 treated haemophiliacs, of which at least 1,243 were infected with HIV, which gives us an infection rate of at least something like 32 to 42%. And if you were to refine that to severe haemophiliacs, it would be much higher. And also, if you were to take out Scotland, where the incidence of HIV was lower due to them being more self-sufficient, it goes close, as you were saying, if not beyond 50%. So huge differences. And if we were looking at, as in Belgium, something like 1 or 2%, we'd be talking about 30 to 40 30 to 60 people here being infected with HIV, as opposed to going into the thousands. So it's huge differences in that decision making.
Yeah, and you see it also in the United States, with about 20,000 hemophiliacs. More than 10,000 have been contaminated with HIV. Mm-hmm. And there they used, let's say, mainly American concentrates from paid donors. And there are just a few centers where they used small pool cryoprecipitate from, let's say, a small group of donors. And in these centers in the United States, you see also low percentages of HIV. And I remember quite well from 1977, when Peter Jones, the pediatrician from Newcastle, who visited the Netherlands, and that was because he presented the Dutch version of Living with Haemophilia, which was an important book in that time. And during that meeting, Peter Jones stressed the importance of the Dutch blood transfusion system, which was highly self-sufficient at that time. That as a hematologist from the UK, he was very jealous on our system.
Wow. No, I mean, a lot of people, listening at the moment will be familiar with Peter Jones. No doubt some of the people watching will have been treated, by Peter Jones. So it's quite something to hear that, he was in the Netherlands and saw how much better the system. Just remind me again, what year was that, Cees, that Peter Jones was there? Sorry.
I think it was 1977, 1978.
Right, so quite early on, really, and
yeah,
well before AIDS came on to the scene. And so what was he was kind of quite envious of the situation in the Netherlands, you were saying?
Yes.
Wow. Well, I wanted to come on to you've previously provided me with a written statement that you gave to the Japanese Haemophilia Society, and the focus of that really is on the 1983 World Federation of Haemophilia conference, which you've mentioned throughout the conversation already, and it's got a particular focus on AIDS. And of course 1983, as we've been discussing, was a critical year in the history of AIDS and blood products. Something that seemed quite important to me that I read in your statement was where you say that Charles Carman had said not to be too critical of the pharmaceutical companies at that time. Could you maybe explain who Charles Carman was and where that opinion not to be critical of the companies was coming from?
Well, since I was in Tel Aviv in 1979, I attended all the World Federation conferences. So I was in Bonn in 1980, in Costa Rica in 1981. And then the next one was in Stockholm in 1983 in May. Mm-hmm. And because we had launched and informed our hemophilia community widely about the possible contamination with HIV, I had high expectations of that conference. But as soon as I arrived on my flight to Stockholm, I had to stop over in Copenhagen. And on the airport of Copenhagen, I met the delegation from the Greek Haemophilia Society,
right,
who I knew by then. And in the airport terminal, I discussed with them the possible contamination with HIV and what was their opinion about it. And then they tried to silence me because they were afraid to discuss AIDS with their community. And so they were very shocked to hear from me that we had sent warning letters to our members, because that was much too far for the Greek Haemophilia Society at that moment. So that was, let's say, a warning already before I arrived in Stockholm. And during the pre-meetings and the conversations with people in Stockholm, I already learned very soon that not everyone was convinced that there was an HIV problem. And when we had the General Assembly of the World Federation and we wanted to discuss the HIV issue, there was a large reluctance to talk about it.
right.
So there were only two countries, Switzerland and the Netherlands, who opposed in the General Assembly that who opposed, let's say, the calm down attitude from the World Federation.
Yeah.
And Charles Carman, at that time, I think he was the president of the National Haemophilia Foundation in the United States, or anyhow, somewhere in the board. And he was also, at that time, I believe, vice president of the World Federation. And he mentioned there that we should be careful to criticize the pharmaceutical companies who produced hemophilia products, because he and maybe also a lot of other American hemophiliacs and doctors were afraid that they would stop down from this business. And this was so totally the atmosphere wherein we could discuss all the HIV safety measures with our own blood transfusion services, that it hadn't come up in my mind that producers would stop with the production. And so I was very suspicious about these way of communication.
Sure.
And it felt as a way that we were, let's say, rather patronized and tried to calm down in our, let's say, call for action.
Mm-hmm. And I understand later that Charles Carman started a consulting company that worked for the blood processing companies in the early 90s, and there were people calling for him to resign then over a potential conflict of interest. What happened there?
Well, during the Stockholm conference, Frank Snabel was still the president of the World Federation, but it looked like he was not feeling very well. So Charles Carman was more or less the spokesperson for the board of the World Federation. And when Frank Snabel died in 1987, I believe, because of AIDS, Charles Carman was his successor as president of the World Federation. And he was also still NHF. And then I think an important moment is that the unrest of how the National Haemophilia Foundation in the United States handled the whole HIV crisis became more clearer around 1992, when a couple of American hemophiliacs visited the International AIDS Conference in Yokohama. And there they picked up a lot of information about what was going on internationally on hemophilia and HIV.
Yeah.
And the conference in Yokohama was in 1990 or 1991. I'm not quite sure, but in 1992, the International AIDS Conference was in Amsterdam. And I was asked to organize a session on hemophilia and AIDS there. And so I became familiar with the Committee of 10,000, which was, let's say, an action group from hemophiliacs who were not in agreement with the way the National Haemophilia Foundation handled the situation in the United States. And these representatives from the Committee of 10,000 were also followed by lawyers from the commercial companies. So let's say, besides the session I had to organize, in that session, I was very open about how we handled the situation in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, they came to me and asked much more in detail what we did. And so I heard also their stories about what happened in the United States. So I learned that there was a conflict between, let's say, the official Haemophilia Society and the grassroots organization from the Committee of 10,000, which tried to represent the interest of the hemophiliacs who were HIV contaminated and who wanted to have compensation for this infection. Mm-hmm. And so I heard a lot about all kinds of lawsuits that were going on, but without much results. And when somewhere around 1992, 1993, the negotiation started between the hemophilia communities and the companies about compensation. When they came to the place where the conversation took place, it showed up that Charles Carman was representing the companies instead of the hemophilia. Wow. So the grassroots organizations, the Committee of 10,000, perceived that as a large conflict of interest, and they stepped down from the negotiation process and wanted to have another representative from the side of the companies. And more or less as a result of that, and that conflict of interest of Charles Carman being a hemophiliac, being the president of the World Federation of Haemophilia, and also have a consultancy firm which represented the companies, was for the World Federation a sign that he had to retire as president of the World Federation.
Right.
So in 1993, there was a large clean-up of the organization of the World Federation, and then Brian O'Mahony from the Irish Haemophilia Society became president of the World Federation. So this was the first time a non-American Canadian president of the World Federation was there. It was a European president, and Brian and his team more or less had to clean up the image of the World Federation, which was heavily influenced by, let's say, the conflict of interest, which was there from, let's say, my first time I was in Tel Aviv till around 1992, 1993, when Charles Carman resigned.
When you were actually at these conferences throughout the early 80s, did you get a vibe, or did you see things that you think could be conflicts of interest in terms of the relationships between doctors and company representatives? Kind of what did you see in that regard? Do you feel there were conflicts there at the time with doctors consulting to companies? Did you see anything like that at the time?
Well, maybe at that time, my understanding of these conflicts was not that much as it is now. But as you can read in the book of Pete Hagen, we described that there was a conflict of interest. And I believe these conflicts of interest are even there at the moment. You see that a lot of hemophilia doctors are doing research for the companies on new products.
Mm-hmm.
And in almost all hemophilia research articles, you see that these trials are sponsored by the companies.
Yes.
So that's far from independent research. So I think we signaled these conflicts of interest that's already 40 years ago, and it's still going on.
Mm.
And maybe in between it has been a little bit lower because of all the court cases that have been and all the issues around compensation. But in the course of the time, people tend to forget what happened in the past. And now I think the companies have a large influence on the way hemophilia research is performed. And I think that internationally and at European level, we lack enough independent researchers.
Mm. No, I think so. And, we've mentioned Piet Hagen's book quite a lot throughout this conversation, but I think now is probably a good moment to let everyone know about this book that you've been working on. And I'm sure, our community will show you every support with this. Cees, could you tell us, you've been working on a book. What is the book called, and what can people expect from that book that you've been working on?
Well, 2 years ago, my colleague Annemarie de Knecht and I decided to write a book about the history of hemophilia and my own life. But last summer, when we had a couple of people who did some proofreading, they suggested to us that I had to switch to write my own autobiography, because for most people that would be more interesting than to read a book about the history of hemophilia. So the new book, which is called Surviving with Haemophilia, is, let's say, the story of my life till now. And at the moment I'm 69. But I tell also about what I perceived as the history of hemophilia in my life and the developments with, let's say, I had to live the first 16 years of my life without treatment. And when I was around 16, the first products for hemophilia were introduced. And so I described that. And then the happy period where a lot of things were possible with the introduction of home treatment prophylaxis. But then also the drawback because of hepatitis and HIV. And the chapters on HIV are quite extensive because that plays a large role in my life, as I became also the coordinator of the Netherlands Haemophilia Society in 1987 till 1998. So the whole period of unrest in the world of hemophilia, I have experienced myself. And in that time, I have traveled a lot to the United States to meetings of the National Haemophilia Foundation to learn how we should cope in the Netherlands with HIV. And as you mentioned earlier, I was also asked for an affidavit about the Stockholm Congress in 1983 by the Japanese hemophilia community, and that was in 1996. So at that time, I traveled 2 times to Japan, and that was a very extraordinary experience, because in Japan there has been a lot of denial about the HIV problem, and so there are a lot of these kind of stories in my book. And I also describe, let's say, the fact that I was transmitted myself with hepatitis and HIV, because when I went to these World Federation conferences in 1980 and 1981, and also on holiday to Italy, I used a few times American concentrates. So, and from this period, I was transmitted with HIV already as one of the first people, I think, with hemophilia. And that has been documented also in my medical records.
Mhm.
And so I also experienced the advent of, let's say, the first treatments for HIV.
Yeah.
And the new treatments for HIV in 1996. So I was very lucky to survive HIV. And as I am one of the only persons who is still alive at the moment, who had, let's say, his experience as a hemophiliac with HIV and hepatitis and the side effects, but also has a lot of knowledge about the broader picture of hemophilia and HIV worldwide. I have described that all in my book.
Wow, that is it. When is it out, Cees? When does it come out, and how can people get it?
Well, it will be available at the end of July.
Right.
The designer is now working on it. And when printing is done, it will be the end of July. And then there will be which I will communicate with you, where people can order the book. And I decided to write a book directly in English, not in Dutch. So the Dutch translation will be available early next year. But I thought that worldwide there would be some interest in this whole global hemophilia HIV picture. And we document, let's say, all the different inquiries which are held by now in the different countries, and all the available literature. We summarize that at the book. So it's, let's say, a good recent encyclopedia of hemophilia and HIV told by, let's say, a person who experienced it by himself.
Definitely. I mean, Cees, if you were asked, because this is so fascinating to me, and I'm sure everybody watching, if you were asked by our inquiry going on now to give evidence, would you be willing to do that?
Yes, absolutely, because I think I have to compliment you and your organization on what you are doing. Let's say, to act of your parents who have died because of this. And as children, you want to have insight on how this could have happened.
Yes.
I'm absolutely able and willing to come to the UK to give my opinion about what happened at these times. Worldwide, I cannot speak about the situation in the UK because I was much less familiar with that. But I think you receive compliments for starting this up. And I also have to say that we have seen a lot of inquiries in different countries. But what is lacking till now is, let's say, the connecting between these national inquiries into an international inquiry into the behavior of the companies.
Sure.
Because most of the inquiries are going about the behavior of the government, but not about the companies.
Mm-hmm.
And because the companies are multinationals, this has been one of the most difficult parts of, let's say, this total increase. And I have been a witness for Japan and also for the Canadian Mounted Police when they were working on their inquiry there.
Was that the one into
Unfortunately,
Armour
the Canadian Mounted
Pharmaceuticals?
Police did not finish that, and instead we have the Creever inquiry. But I think the fact that within the hemophilia community we have lost more than 15,000 people because of these HIV infections, and also a considerable number of hemophiliacs because of hepatitis. And still the people who are alive are experiencing the daily problems of the intake of the medication and the consequences of long-term diseases like HIV and hepatitis. I think we have to pressure on an international inquiry as well.
Definitely. And the work you mentioned there with the Canadian police, was that on their investigation into the Armour pharmaceutical company?
Yes, because we in the Netherlands we also had one case of a hemophiliac who became HIV infected through the heat treated concentrate from Armour, which was not heat treated well enough.
Yes, that's correct. Well, Cees, I'm watching the comments as we're speaking, and people are. It seems very keen to read the book. They're saying come to the UK and do a book signing at the inquiry. So we'll have to see how that all pans out. But Cees, look, we've took far too much of your time, and we've spoken already about once the book is out, it would be great to have you on again and to talk more about all of this stuff. So we will leave it there. But Cees, thank you so much. It's been so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, well, my thanks are to you for organizing this. And I wish everyone all the best who is listening at the moment. And I'm certainly willing to tell you more about the book at the end of July. And as soon as I have an ebook version, I will mail it to you so you can prepare the next live stream.
Yes. No, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks. Well, so that was Cees Smit, everyone. And wow, what an amazing guy, and what an amazing just the amount of knowledge he has, and the amount of experience, and the amount of time he's been doing this and campaigning is unbelievable. And the results speak for themselves in terms of the outcomes that they had there in the Netherlands compared to what happened here in the UK. And I'm genuinely really looking forward to reading Cees's book, and we will have him on again, no doubt. So moving on, I want to come back to the fact that last week I did say that today's live stream was going to have a panorama theme, and as I said earlier, I wasn't sure about the copyright issues. I thought the live stream could potentially get disconnected halfway through or something like that. So we didn't go that way, and I think it was actually much better to get Cees on today as well, because I think it's just so fascinating what he has to say. And I know there's so much more. We've already ran over time with Cees, but he just has so much to say, and it's so interesting to hear. So a couple of updates before we bring this to an end, and there's quite a few actually. So the first one is, no one's getting any points for guessing this, but we've had no response, still no acknowledgement on the letter to the Prime Minister. We did write, as soon as the answer to the written questions came in, saying that Penny Mordaunt at the Cabinet Office, the Paymaster General, is the new minister responsible for the infected blood inquiry. And I say thanks to everyone actually that contacted their MP to ask them to ask questions about the framework for compensation, which prompted the Cabinet Office to reveal that, because up until then we still weren't quite sure who the Minister for the Inquiry was. We thought it could be Michael Gove, we thought it could be Lord True and a number of other people. It turns out to be Penny Mordaunt, so there you go, we finally know that. We've written to her along the same lines as the letter to the Prime Minister, so we shall wait and see. Hopefully Penny is more kind of gracious in her handling of us than we have experienced in the past. I think she may be. I hope she will be. Time will tell. We shall wait and see. All the shop orders, I believe, shout out to Mr. Squeegis once again. All the shop orders, I believe, have now been sent out. As I said, the other weekend, when we first did the mail out to let everyone know that the campaign ribbons are on the shop and it was fully open, we sold something like 100 products through the shop, and thank you again to everyone for doing that and supporting the campaign. I reiterate again that all of that stuff, the ribbons, t-shirts, hats, whatever, that's sold through the shop, every penny after the costs goes directly back into the campaign to help us do things like this and cover all our various, there are quite a lot of costs, in the campaign when it comes down to the FOI platforms, the websites, the emails, the server space, the backup of all the documents. It does all rack up. So thank you to everyone that helps to support the campaign, whether that's by ordering stuff off the shop or by making donations to the campaign. It all really, really helps and helps to make this stuff possible. Now, before we do finish today, just in the spirit of living up kind of 1 or 2% to the spirit of the whole 3 years since Panorama was on thing, I thought it would be maybe just interesting to people really to hear the story of how the Panorama program even came about, because it is kind of a, I don't know what you call it, a funny story or divine intervention or whatever, but this is my recollection of how Panorama even came to be, how the documentary came to air. So at some point throughout 2016, I would say, probably early 2016, I had started to contact a load of different production companies, trying to entertain them in the idea of a documentary about the Contaminated Blood Scandal. Eventually, after a lot of pitching and a lot of speaking and everything, there was one company called 9 Lives Media that kind of bit, and ironically, coincidentally, the guy at 9 Lives Media was a guy called Mike Lewis, who kind of said, yeah, this sounds really interesting, let's do it. He actually worked on the World in Action program, and I had no idea about this. It's just something that came up at a certain point in time. He'd worked on the World in Action program back in the 70s, which was an amazing kind of fluke of coincidence. And all the while this was going on, so myself and 9 Lives Media, Mike Lewis, we start working on this pitch for a documentary. And at the same time, completely unbeknownst to me, and unbeknown to Aid Goodyear, who many of you will know, had been working with a journalist friend of his on a pitch for a documentary, but with a slightly different tack. So the pitch for the documentary I'd been working on was kind of looking at it on a national scale, the scandal. And Aid had been working on this pitch with a journalist friend of his, which was very much focused on the Trelaw school and the kind of story there with that focus. So these two pitches had been in the works, and I believe there was also another pitch going on that I became aware of in the periphery as well. I'm not sure that one ever got sent in, but I know mine, the one I've been working on and the one Aid had been working on, definitely did. And what ended up happening, and this only transpired to be the case later on when me and Aid spoke to each other about it. They went into the BBC, pitched as a documentary idea at basically exactly the same time, completely unbeknownst to each other. And ultimately, we don't know the exact details, but we know the outcome was that the BBC kind of had a lot of discussion about this. They got these two pitches, and they had the national kind of overlook one from me, they had the Trelaw one from Aid, and ultimately, as we know, what ended up happening was basically an amalgamation of the two, where the Panorama episode ended up looking at it on a national scale, but heavily featuring the Trelaw story as a hook within the documentary. And me and Aid often have joked to each other about it being, we call it the trifecta attack, of there being kind of all these three different pitches kind of being around, and two of them going in at the same time, and that's basically how it came about. And it was funny speaking to Aid about it afterwards, that we just didn't know. And in hindsight, I ask myself, and I've said this to Aid, if only one of the pitches would have went in, maybe it wouldn't have gone anywhere. But because there were two pitches from two reputable people, production companies at the same time, I think that really caught the BBC's interest, that had happened, that this must be a real issue, and a current thing, or a thing that's resurged. So yeah, that is how it came about. And we spent a good, myself and a number of other people spent a good year almost working on Panorama. And at the time, I was very much, whilst working on it, I was very much focused on this needs to be documents, evidence, nuts and bolts. And I was very much of the mindset at that time that, as far as human interest, the personal story element, the fact that it's a tragedy, as true as that is, and as real as that is, I felt like it had been done, and I felt like there was only so much mileage in it, and it was going to take something different to take us to the next stage. And I did feel, at the time when Panorama was on, I felt like there wasn't the evidence, there wasn't the documents and stuff that I wanted and thought there would be in it. But in hindsight, when I look back on it now, it was a milestone and it served its purpose. It brought great awareness. And I think one huge, positive of it was that was our springboard, really, when Panorama was on, to launch or to make it public knowledge that the legal action with Collins was in the works. Because, of course, for months before Panorama, myself and another individual had been working closely with Collins. Collins had lodged a claim in my name with the Department of Health as a singular claim. But we knew that in order to launch that in the right way, and for as many people as possible to know, we needed a platform. And Panorama was that platform. And I think it really helped us to get the awareness out there of the Collins thing. And I am glad in hindsight that we kind of sat on it a little bit in terms of making it public knowledge. We waited for Panorama so Panorama could have the exclusive kind of this is what's happening on that. And I think it's one of the reasons why Collins managed to accumulate so many clients so quickly. And of course, as we know, they accumulated people, not just the people that already knew each other through social media and various other discussion forums and boards online, but people that were just not part of the community, people that had, tried to put this away to whatever extent that they could, but all the while, it still was burning up inside of them. So yeah, although in terms of content, it maybe didn't have it all, I still think it was good in terms of that awareness and that platform. And I'm certainly very grateful to everyone who was involved and helped and everything that happened since. So there you go. We lived up to the Panorama thing a little bit with a bit of a story there. So yes, we're going to leave it there. I'm really looking forward to speaking to Cees again. I just think he was so brilliant. You guys all take care, and we shall be back next Monday. So I'll see you all again then.